Welcome to Work Life Unraveled,
the podcast where two friends explore the ever-evolving landscape of work, culture, and life. I'm Garland.
And I'm Allison. Thanks for joining us as we unravel the topics and trends impacting how we work, how we live, and how we relate to each other.
So glad you're here.
Welcome to Work Life Unraveled. We are so excited to do this because we've been talking about it. Allison and I have these amazing conversations that we are the only one privy to. And so this is our attempt and our hope that you are able to listen in, glean some of the insights and some of the things that we're noticing, and hope that it forces you to kind of think about, wow, like, I never thought about that. Or I thought about that too. Or, oh my goodness, what are we going to do about that? And so this is why we're doing this show.
Yeah. And I think, Garland, you and I just have such great free-flowing conversations about things that are happening in research and science, things that are happening that are affecting us at work and also affecting our personal lives. And over the last few years, everything has gotten really knitted together in terms of personal life and professional life. And so we wanted to help people just with some research, some articles, some resources that we found, and also some strategies maybe to help make things a little bit easier as we continue to hurdle into the future, especially with technology changing at an ever increasing rate.
For sure. So this week's topic, we're talking about neurodiversity at work. We stumbled on an article and had some, I'd say pearl clutching moments
Yes.
of, oh my God,
Yes.
is this real? So do you want to share those statistics that we came across? And then we can kind of talk through the ones that were, I'd say, the most, I don't want to say alarming, but a little concerning for us.
Yeah, I think even rolling it back so people understand what neurodivergence really means. I think neurotypical and neurodivergent are terms that you and I kind of throw around, but not everybody necessarily understands what they mean. So, neurodivergent, if you Google today, what is neurodivergent, you're going to come up with a definition that usually mentions autism spectrum disorder, ADHD. It could also mention OCD, dyslexia, hyperlexia, basically sensory processing disorder, and things that relate to how you mentally and how your brain kind of perceives the world around you differently from those who are considered neurotypical.
Yeah. And this is a spectrum, which makes
Yes.
it more interesting because how each person presents or how they are processing the world is not a one size fits all, even across those different conditions that you just named. And so it's always, I think what makes it so interesting is that because it works for one doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for all, even within the neurodiverse population. And I don't know that a lot of people even think about that. So what I think is great about us doing this is hopefully we're going to enlighten, but also just educate, but also think about how this impacts your work and your life, because you don't turn that off. You can't turn your brain off when you go to work. If anything, it's where you're supposed to be the most on. And I think what's interesting about these statistics is nobody's considering that some of this is also invisible.
Yes.
That's another part of this. Nobody knows unless you're telling them. And even still, sometimes they don't believe you. So we'll talk about that too.
For sure. And I want to go back for just a second because you said spectrum. And I think using autism spectrum disorder as a good example because it's literally in the name. And I think people have heard about it the most. A lot of people, when you say spectrum, they think of maybe the color spectrum that's a line. It's actually more like a circle. And so if you think about autism as this different collection of traits that people experience. And so we'll even in the show notes put some resources in so you can see the spectrum of autism and all these different kind of expressions of it. But if in that circle, you've got all these different pieces of pie, which are different experiences, different symptoms, if you will, and people will rate higher or lower based on their own unique expression on the autism spectrum. So it's more like a fingerprint than it is a spot on a line. And it really is, within each of these different categories of neurodivergence, they're very complex. There are some things that overlap one another. We'll talk about diagnostics maybe a little bit, but not everybody up until this point who is on the autism spectrum has been diagnosed, and diagnosis is going up as people learn more, and as we get into a period where more women are being considered as part of the research process for autism and other neurodivergent disorders, if you will. But let's dive into some of the great statistics that we found. And I'll let you go ahead and kick it off, Garland, with whatever one is maybe your favorite or the most interesting or
Yeah,
surprising.
I think 76% of neurodivergent employees do not disclose their condition at work. Disclosure means someone is telling either a manager or an HR person, I have this condition, and as a
Mm-hmm.
result, I may need accommodations in terms
Mm-hmm.
of whether it's text to speech stuff, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
an actual physical accommodation like a certain kind of desk or a certain kind of keyboard or a certain kind of processing, like I will be wearing earphones because
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to have any, sound that
Mm-hmm.
distracts me. And
Yep.
so when you have 76%, that is a lot of people who are walking around who have things going on with them that they do not feel comfortable
Mm-hmm.
sharing, or just do not feel like that information would be received
Mm-hmm.
in a way that allows them to not be seen as less than, as not able, as not competent,
Mm-hmm.
etc.
Yeah. I think this one is so important. And so I've been thinking of different relevant examples of how this might work out in the workplace. And of course, you and I have spent most of our time in commercial real estate and the brokerage world. We both came from the brokerage world for the earlier parts of our career. So I think about how those brokerage offices are laid out. And one of the things that's really common, at least for the sales side of commercial real estate brokerage, is a bullpen environment. I don't know, Garland, if you've ever sat in a bullpen. I have, and it was a difficult experience for me. And I think, when we think about these different types of sensory processing disorders, one of those is auditory processing disorder. And that is something that actually impacts how the brain processes sounds. So people might have difficulty if they're on the phone with a client and they're listening to the client, but over here, they're hearing maybe the conversations of their colleagues, they're hearing other sales calls, maybe they're hearing the buzzing of the lights and all the different ambient noises of an office. And that could be one example of people having a hard time, specifically in commercial real estate, because of that bullpen kind of setting. And if you're not disclosing, and you might not even know, you might think, oh geez, I really have a hard time making my calls, I prefer to go to the phone booth, or I prefer to make my phone calls outside, or what have you. That auditory processing is just one way that neurodivergence can show up in the workplace and be very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I think about the people who wear earphones a lot, and the
Yes.
impression that they are giving is that you're not present, or that you're not, available.
Mm-hmm.
When some people put them in to just muffle sound and
Mm-hmm.
to just not want to have a lot, or if you do have focus work that you have to do where
Sure.
you don't need distraction, and you put on, whether it's noise canceling or an actual more larger earphone, and
Mm-hmm.
then I have heard this
Mm-hmm.
from older managers or managers that say you always have your earphones in. They think you're
Mm-hmm.
listening to music. They could
Yep.
assume that that's what you're doing,
Yes.
when in actuality you are just trying to block out sound. And so there's assumptions that are made
Yes.
about people because of things that they are doing in order to accommodate themselves,
Yes.
because they are not disclosing at work that
Yes.
something is needed.
Yeah.
And the impression and the perceptions that are had because
Mhm.
not disclosing what's really going on with you.
Yeah. And we're not talking about a small group of people. And I think this to me is one of the biggest stats and the things that really puts it into perspective for me. So 15 to 20% of the global population is neurodivergent, or 1 in 5. And so if you look around your offices, if you look around your families, your communities, your church communities, and things like that, this is not a small portion of the population whatsoever. And the world really isn't built for them. The world is built for that other 80% of people. And so that 20%, is uncomfortable in many different ways perhaps in your environment, but they're doing something called masking. They're kind of coping as best that they can with the environment, and maybe bringing a different self to work than they actually are. And so there's actually a great video that I saw that I'll put in the resources that had a woman take 4 cups of white rice and 1 cup of wild rice, right? To have the right proportions for 1 out of 5 being neurodivergent. That's the wild rice. And so she mixed it together. And once you mix it together, then she started to take handfuls of the rice and put them into different buckets. So there was one, I think, for work, there was one for school, there was one for church. And you very quickly see that neurodivergence is all around us. It's
Everywhere.
everywhere, everywhere. But it's really not talked about. And I think one of the reasons that it isn't talked about, to your point earlier, Garland, is people don't feel safe. They feel they might be stigmatized or diminished or disrespected, perhaps, if they were to admit it. I would say younger generations, I'm seeing even just in more casual kind of social interactions, or as I'm talking to candidates, they might say, "Oh, I'm so OCD," or "Oh, I'm so ADHD." And some of that might be diagnosed, some of that might be self diagnosed. But I do think that certain types of neurodivergence are becoming more openly talked about and more openly accepted. But I think there's still a very long way to go in opening up our arms and kind of bringing these people in, and also building environments that are welcoming for those people as well. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier was this idea of auditory processing disorder. Sensory processing disorder could also mean maybe you walk into a colleague's office and the lights are off. Overhead lighting and the noise that overhead lighting makes could be something that sets off a person with sensory processing disorder. And so I've actually seen, I would say, more cutting edge corporate environments go as far as creating sensory safer rooms for people to go and decompress, for people to go and do their work, and creating these softer spaces from a lighting standpoint, from a surface standpoint, for people who, maybe are neurodivergent and have a hard time with kind of the traditional work environment.
Yeah. When you were talking about generations and the divide there, I think the statistic that I find to be interesting is Gen Z and millennials currently make up 38% of the global workforce, which basically means they're just getting started in terms of
Mm-hmm.
more of them coming in. But 38% is a very big amount,
Mm-hmm.
and that the percentage is expected to rise to 58% by 2030, which is in 6 years.
Yeah.
And so, although you may think, oh, this may be for a certain group, this is your future workforce. This is the
Mm-hmm.
folks who are coming up. And as someone who is raising a Gen Zer,
Mm-hmm.
they are a lot less concerned about
Mm-hmm.
being somebody else and
Mm-hmm.
pretending to be somebody else. And so that is not going to be something that is compromisable for very many of them. There will be an expectation that workplaces are able to receive, accommodate, not stigmatize,
Mm-hmm.
and and this also includes anxiety. This
Mm-hmm.
also includes depression. I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a lot of other um, things other than the ones we've named. There's a long list of things,
Yeah.
honestly. And so people's mental health is
Mm-hmm.
really critical,
Mm-hmm.
and ensuring that there are benefits
Mm-hmm.
available in
Mm-hmm.
organizations in order to feel as though people are not having to go outside to get the
Mm-hmm.
help that they need in their day to day.
For sure. And we'll be sure to put a more comprehensive definition of neurodivergence and neurotypical in the show notes. This is meant to be an overview to kind of introduce you to this topic and to get you started thinking about it. We want the wheels turning, not just for individuals, but for companies, and thinking about how they're going to address this next challenge that we think is about to really have a huge impact on the workforce in a way that we've never seen before. In fact, and this statistic absolutely blew my mind, and I'm still thinking about it on an almost daily basis. But if you look at Gen Z, 53% of them, so not the minority, the majority of Gen Z identify as neurodiverse, and they are the next generation moving into the workforce. They're also digitally native. They are also very open when they have bad experiences on social media sites like Glassdoor, like Google, and things like that. But to me, it was astounding. And certainly the rising rates of neurodivergence in the US, I think, have a lot to do with the fact that we know so much more now than we did back then. Our diagnostic criteria has gotten better. The actual criteria that they used for diagnosing a lot of these conditions didn't even involve females, whether
Women.
adults or children, until women. I'm sorry, women until the 1990s. So I think there's a huge catch up that we're playing in terms of there are generations of people who are millennials, X, even boomers, who were never diagnosed, who have these characteristics. And then Gen Z, I think, is being diagnosed earlier and faster and with better criteria, and then also are self-diagnosing to a degree as well.
In that, I think there is that what this is.
Mm-hmm.
Like they are not going to explain to you what it is. They're expecting you to know what it is.
Yes,
And that
yes,
you're able to jump in and help them get the resources that they need. And very often I think that, I mean, this is why this conversation I think is so important for us, is this is your future workforce. And
yes.
so if this is not something that you're currently addressing, thinking about, understand, uh, you know, 75% aren't going to disclose.
Mm-hmm.
Some may not even, like you said, know.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that you need to be thinking about as to how you're going to incorporate some of this into your work. I think about, we have to talk about executive functioning.
Mm.
We
Yes.
have to talk about executive functioning because in some of these conditions, and
Mm-hmm.
executive functioning is, we want to define it as the sequence of steps that you usually take in order to complete a
Mm-hmm.
task.
Mm-hmm.
It's the sequence and the series of things that need to happen. And sometimes there are folks who have a hard time putting the steps together
Mm-hmm.
and staying on track. And I
Mm-hmm.
think about a lot of the work that we're doing in organizations now, where you're given a project or you're giving a task, and the expectation is that you're going to be able to complete it start to finish,
Mm-hmm.
um, with minimal oversight or minimal, assistance. Um, and that is determining your effectiveness, your competence, your ability to
Mm-hmm.
perform. And so if you are someone who has executive functioning issues,
Mm-hmm.
how do you let your manager know that this is
Mm-hmm.
something that you may need some additional assistance for, and that they're not going to think that means you're not able to do it,
Mm-hmm.
um, within the timely fashion, because we're all working
Mm-hmm.
so busy, right? So timely, we need it now. And
Mm-hmm.
I want us to look at technologies, because there's a
Mm-hmm.
variety of technologies out there now. With the beauty of AI, I know some
Yes.
people are using AI as, oh my gosh, AI is coming to take anyone's job. Actually, AI is coming to enhance people's
Yes.
jobs. And I think when I think about neurodivergent people, I think about how technology can be leveraged to provide assistance.
Yeah, I agree. And I think companies that are able to harness the unique skill sets and abilities of people who are neurodivergent are the ones that are going to win the day moving forward. And there are some examples of companies who have been adaptive and have specifically sought out people in the neurodivergent and the disability communities. And one example of that is Ernst and Young. And they have done intensive studies about their work in this area and have registered $1 billion worth of return on investment for those types of solutions, and have also saved 3.5 million hours using neurodivergent talent to their strengths and working with them in a specific way that's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
I would also mention too, oh, sorry.
No, go.
I would also mention too that the diagnostic kind of process, and also when disabilities are acquired, happens for most people much later than you might think. I think, sometimes when people think about someone who's on the autism spectrum, they might think of a child in school who's been diagnosed early. 80% of disabilities are actually acquired between the ages of 18 and 64. And so you have folks that are being maybe diagnosed or struggling and not having a diagnosis or an understanding of what's happening in your workplaces too. And that's why I think it's that much more important to learn about this topic, to educate yourselves, to understand kind of the unique skills and capabilities of folks that are neurodivergent, to be able to create a supportive environment for those folks who might be impacted and neurodivergent, but don't necessarily know it yet.
Yeah, I can speak I think the 18 to 64 is very real. To the adults who I find who get diagnosed or diagnosed because of their children. Their children present things, and then when they are going through the testing process with their kids is when they realize, oh, I do that too, or that's me too. Also, what I have found is a lot of, specifically in women, because we have not done enough research with women, a lot of high functioning,
Yes.
very high achieving women are burnt out at some point because there's just a lot to manage. And then when you couple that with the period known as perimenopause and
Yes.
menopause, when
Yes.
women start to have hormonal imbalances and different things going on, there is a crop of women that are becoming aware of neurodivergence in midlife, or just kind of going through the motions before, but now that the biological tools that used to keep
Yep.
them going are starting to fail, a lot of women are realizing in midlife that, oh, wow, this explains so much of my life. And so I think that we need to not be, like you said, thinking about this for children. The children are there. And the thing is, the children will grow up and become your future workforce, because none of this goes away. I think that's important, because I know there was a rumor at one point ADHD goes away, or certain things go away.
Yeah.
And I'm like, nothing goes away. It transforms maybe, but it doesn't go anywhere.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that one, that it goes away.
Oh, yeah.
I think too, while we're on ADHD for a second, I think a lot of people are very familiar with the hyperactive expression of ADHD, but not the other expression of ADHD, which is inattentive. And I think oftentimes, as that's found more in women and girls, that ADHD looks like the hyperactive kid who's bouncing all over the place, but you might not understand that it could also be, the young girl who is in a beanbag chair in the corner under a blanket reading a book. I think too, all of the stereotypes that we have about how these things present are typically male. And as you were talking about kind of women who are kind of getting to a certain age, you and I fall in that camp. And I think one of the things that I've read about, the idea of having a child who presents certain difficulties or certain symptoms and goes through a diagnosis process is that, so much of this is genetic. And so if I'm a mother and I have a child who is presenting as ADHD, I wasn't necessarily able to get diagnosed, but I see that open door and that open pathway. And there's this whole kind of lost generation that they talk about of women our age who presented maybe the inattentive ADHD or not the high needs portion of the autism spectrum disorder, but low support needs and highly kind of functional side of autism. And so I do think there's a wave of this happening. There are people today in your workforce who are parents of kids on the autism spectrum that have ADHD. They, I think, would love to participate in initiatives in ERGs, employee resource groups, to support organizations and nonprofits that are doing this kind of work because it is so close to the people that are all around you on a daily basis. I would challenge you all. I don't know that I know of one person who I could ask who doesn't have some kind of close relationship or attachment to someone who is neurodivergent.
I 100% agree. And I think it's interesting because it is a what I have the so as someone who helps with ERG, starts ERGs, etc., builds community around centers of inclusion. I think some workplaces, if you've got a critical mass of people who feel empowered, particularly in leadership, yes, starting a group like this is like super easy. But if it's
Mhm,
a group of people who are not at a leadership level,
mhm,
to even disclose, to then
mhm,
even get it started is very much of a challenge. So I think workplaces, even just having it be environments where people start to feel comfortable sharing is step one. But if someone does want to, even if it's starting a book club that
mhm,
works on certain things
mhm,
around neurodivergence, it doesn't need to be big, but I think
mhm.
addressing it and having a group is huge. We can talk about tech for a hot second because I
Yeah.
think when it presents in
Mhm,
male, high functioning
mhm,
male, which is
mhm,
I feel like the tech industry, and
mhm.
there's I think no shadow of a doubt that your favorite tech CEO is neurodivergent.
Yes, yes,
Um,
yes,
we can name them, but I'm sure you already
yeah.
know who they are.
Go to
Your
Twitter for a
favorite tech
minute.
CEO, yeah,
Yeah.
your favorite tech CEO is neurodivergent, and because of his privilege and his
Mhm,
position in the system, the caste
mhm,
system that is America, when it is a man, he can get an assistant,
mhm,
he can set up the whole workplace so that there are foosball tables and there
mhm,
are a variety of things that you have on-site cafeteria, you have on-site dental,
mhm.
you have on-site massage. I'm talking to you, Google. There's a lot of places that have set up workplaces in
Mhm,
order for their neurodivergent um, team members to
mhm.
just frictionless ability to move around and get certain
Yep.
things met, needs met, right?
Mhm,
So I use them as an example simply because you can build a culture around it if you want in order
mhm,
to attract and retain a workforce of
mhm,
software developers
mhm.
and programmers and
Analysts.
soon to
Yeah,
be
yeah.
analysts, AI folks. And so we can do it or we have done it. The question is, how can that look specifically is varying on the
Mhm.
organization and what's going on.
For sure. And I think to put it into context, again, this is 20% of your organization. This is not a small number of people. And so, if 20% of your organization had mobility issues, would you have an office that had stairwells everywhere? No, you wouldn't. It just doesn't make any sense. And so, as we understand more and more and learn about these statistics and learn about these individual unique profiles of neurodivergence, I think we have a real opportunity to wrap our arms around people and to provide spaces and environments and cultures where each individual can show up as they are. One expression isn't better than another. One type of skill set in certain organizations and certain industries, like commercial real estate, I find that extroversion is really lauded and certain types of behaviors are really lauded. And these types of profiles and these types of skill sets are just as valid, just as important to the functioning of these organizations, but they haven't been recognized as such, and they haven't been empowered to be who they are and use their unique skills and gifts the way that those extroverted, I think about these, senior brokers who are rainmakers at different firms, and their kind of profile and the way that they work. And 1 in 5 of them are neurodivergent too, but those are the folks that might be celebrated. I think the folks that we're talking about who are neurodivergent, I think, are kind of the unsung heroes of a lot of our businesses and a lot of our communities that are, out there maybe doing the work in unrecognized and unappreciated ways, and are kind of white knuckling through our environments that really aren't meant for them. And I think about return to work, and I think about the angst and the struggle that so many people feel. And speak on that, Garland, because I know this is something that we also talk
Oh,
about all the time.
we talk about return to work. I think people are so focused on productivity with return to
Mhm.
work
Yeah,
and seeing people in their workspace
yeah,
when there is a whole host of people who are not returning to work, and it has nothing to do with work. It has to do with
no.
social emotional needs. It has
Hmm.
to do with physical needs. It has to do with, in the case of a neurodivergent person, like the process of getting up and getting through
Yeah.
all the things to get to a physical desk in an office feels Herculean. And we
Yes.
haven't even, built the commute in. We haven't
Yes.
even talked about, again, executive functioning skills to get
Yeah.
yourself ready every day.
Hmm.
It's a lot. And so by the time you get to work, you're exhausted. You're exhausted and you haven't even cracked open the email yet. And so if all someone has to do is wake up, brush their teeth, eat their breakfast, and then come walk across their living room or bedroom or wherever and sit down and log in, you've saved them, I don't know how much mental, social, emotional labor.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's so true. And I think this is not what's talked about at all with return to work or RTO, return to office. And again, 1 in 5 people are feeling this way about getting up in the morning. And if they're in a major city, their commute is probably 45 minutes to an hour, maybe each way. And I just think about, if we looked at the individual, this is all to equity, right? Not everybody has the same sort of abilities or access or what have you. And so we're not trying to give everyone the same thing, and it shouldn't be. We're trying to get people, to the assistance level that they need, where they feel comfortable in what works for them. And this idea that we're going to have this kind of arbitrary one size fits all policy, everyone in the office, everyone these hours, these particular environments, no longer make sense for maximizing productivity. And if productivity leads to outputs like revenue and market share, this is also a solid business decision. It's just not discussed, I think, because that command and control style of leadership, built in way back in the Industrial Revolution, and warehouse workers and punching clocks and all of that, it's just so ingrained in who we are and the way that we work, that we're missing out on an opportunity to have happier people, more productive people, more profitable businesses, if we can find a way to meet people where they are.
Yeah. And 75% are not disclosing. So
No.
when you're pushing and saying, you need to come back, and they're telling you it's a challenge for me, and you're asking them why, and they're not telling you, because I have depression, because I have social anxiety, because I have ADHD, I have autism, I have OCD, I
Mm-hmm.
have executive functioning issues that
Mm-hmm.
are making it difficult for me to get myself out the door to get
Mm-hmm.
to you. Yet they're not going to tell you that because, one, I feel like, let's talk about people even being believed, one,
Yes.
and two,
Yes.
then you're thinking, like you were talking about being
Mm-hmm.
stigmatized as not committed,
Yeah.
not competent, not
Mm-hmm.
dedicated, not whatever
Yeah.
stuff we make up about
Yeah.
what we think it means to show up every day.
For sure. I think this idea that the next generation is lazy or not as hardworking. And I mean, you can go back to time immemorial. I'm talking to the time of the Stoics and find Stoic writings about how people these days and kids these days lack the work ethic and are disappointing in all of these things. So this has always been thought. And so it can't always have been true. And I think that perceived laziness could be neurodivergent. It could be a number of different things. It's just slapping a label on something that is different than you are, as opposed to trying to understand and trying to be curious about what's happening and how the next generation is actually different from you. Yeah, I think so much about this, and I'm so glad that we're having this conversation and people are able to hear it, because I do know, like, I can think off the top of my head of people you and I know in common, three very high performing women at the top of their careers with super, super amazing work and clients and things to their name in terms of accomplishment after accomplishment after accomplishment. And they're not able to have these conversations in their workplaces. And on top of it, they're mothers too. And mothers and women and people presenting as women, I'm getting the language wrong. What should the language be?
No, yeah, no, I feel like at some point we might want to talk about what women means because it's
Yeah.
so much more now.
Yes. No, that's a good point. I'm just going to go ahead and say primary caregivers because men could fall into that category as well.
Yes.
So if you're a primary caregiver, whether for a child or whether an elderly family member or what have you, you're bearing a disproportionate burden of mental labor, physical labor, emotional labor. And so I think on top of neurodivergence, on top of caregiving, these are all things that your employees, your colleagues are dealing with on a daily basis that they might be very, very hesitant to talk about just for those reasons. Because when a promotion comes up, and we know that this happens all the time, who is the promotion going to go to if you have somebody who's in the office burning the midnight oil all the time because the office environment is great for that single person? Or is it going to be the person who works from home 2 or 3 days a week because they're taking care of children or they've got an elderly parent at home? You know, it's unfortunately historically been this person over here. And so I just want to point that out because I think that as we go to work, there are these other lives that we lead, these other roles and hats that we wear in our lives that we carry with us everywhere. And this idea that your team members are just in this little bubble of their professional relationship with you and you're not considering everything else they have going on. I think if you understand that well being is holistic, it's not just one part of your life is good and the other part of your life is over here and separate. It's very integrated, especially the last 4 years. There's almost no overlap sometimes these days.
Yeah, I think that's why we call this podcast work life
Yeah.
because there is no box.
Yeah.
It's kind of
Yeah.
like this. And yes, COVID did force a lot of us to
Mm-hmm.
do this if we weren't doing it already.
Yeah.
But I think it's definitely been a huge part of it. So let's talk about solutions, resources, things. If this whole conversation is going right over here because
Yeah.
you are just like, what? If you, we're going to put these in the show notes as well, like books and things that we have curated. But I feel like I myself went on a rabbit hole of doing work on this because I felt like I had to understand it more. And I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't say I've got a PhD in it, but I definitely have more knowledge and awareness of terminology, awareness of,
Mm-hmm.
what things present. So I feel like far more when I see things, the first place I go is neurodivergence now.
Mm-hmm.
It's not
Mm-hmm.
this person has this or is not responding or is like my
Yeah.
first place I go is they're processing the world differently.
Mm-hmm.
How are they processing the world? What questions do I need to ask? Or what are the
Mm-hmm.
things that I am not aware of that I need to ask them, like what they are thinking about?
Yeah.
Instead of you didn't get back to me. I sent you an email, you didn't get back to me. And I think the assumption is always, oh, you just didn't respond, when you have no idea what's going on the other side of that email.
Yes. One of my favorite questions is, how do you prefer to work, or how do you prefer to communicate? What's the best way to work with you? That really helps me to understand people's communication preferences. Those are also changing dramatically. I think the younger generation wants to talk on the phone much less, and are texters, or maybe even want to send emails. I think understanding and meeting people where they are. I do this already for my clients just naturally to make their lives easier. And I find the older generation wants to talk to me more on the phone, or they want things written out in front of them so they can read prior to us having a conversation. Just thinking about not the golden rule, how do you want to be treated, but the platinum rule, how does that individual want to be treated? And being comfortable with asking them, hey, I'm excited to work with you on this project. What are the best ways for us to work together? Like, do you enjoy using a project management tool? Would you rather have emails? Do you want to do a weekly call, or do you want to pick up the phone whenever you have a question? I think just asking those questions, and being really open and being really accepting of what's on the other side of that question, I think is a big deal. I also think, to harken back to our industry where we spend a lot of time, one of the ways that commercial real estate can really kind of integrate and make people who are neurodivergent feel more welcome is environmentally. And there are all sorts of firms, architectural firms, design firms out there who are kind of leading the way and are cutting edge in how to do this. It could be even as simple as white noise installed in your office spaces. It could be, different ambient temperatures for different spaces. One of the things, and this is not to neurodivergence, but did you know that the temperature of offices today is built on the preferences of like a 40-year-old white man? And that was great when that was all who came to work. But, we're talking about women seriously in the workforce for the last 50, 60 years. Things can be a little bit different now.
How many women do you know that have a heater, a cardigan, a sweater, a something? Okay. I know I used to leave my cardigan because I never knew when I was going to need it.
Do you remember those Snuggies that were fleece and the arms? I had a Snuggie at work because it was so bad. And I challenge all the men who are listening to this to look around their offices and see how many women are truly comfortable in the temperature. But I think environmentally is the quickest way to make a positive change and difference. And it doesn't require really any additional learning. You can make choices every day at work that are going to help people feel more comfortable just by talking to one of these design firms, or reading some articles, or considering that when you are redeveloping your space, expanding your space, and what have you.
Microsoft has a variety of accessibility tools built in. I think unless you use them or you know that they're there, you probably don't know. And so if you're using the Microsoft suite of products, get familiar with the accessibility tools that are there and turn them on in your meetings, because you never know who needs captions. And it's not always neurodiverse folks that need captions. It could be people where English is their second language and they need captions, or just visually how they process is better reading than listening, because they may have some auditory issues. So I think we need to sometimes just take a step back and look at, okay, what else is around us that we already have that we can maybe pull into how we do things, as a means of creating greater inclusion.
Yeah. One other thing that I know is a hot topic, because I just saw actually a CEO post about it on Twitter yesterday, that everyone in his company at every single meeting, whether it's Zoom or in person, I can see your face, right? But in Zoom or on Teams, he wants to see every person's face all the time. I think this is another kind of way to make it easier for your employees, is to not have such rigid ideas of how people are interacting. The processing that it takes to show up on camera, and also the anxiety that a lot of people face being on camera, especially if a meeting is recorded, which often these days a lot of meetings are recorded. I just think this idea that we all need to show up on camera all the time, and it feels like a heightened level of fear, anxiety. People's living situations are different, and the socioeconomic differences that people experience at home. People might live generationally. People might not feel comfortable and only have maybe a bedroom as a private space and not want to bring their workplace into the bedroom. So this idea of flexibility and open-mindedness, that this idea that if you're not looking at people, that those people aren't working. And I know you referenced that before, Garland. It is this weird undertone that if I can't see you, you must be goofing off. We survived what, a year and a half or 2 years working on our own, and productivity increased in a lot of different cases. And so I just want to encourage people who feel exhausted from being on camera and wish they could have more phone calls. Again, think about expressing that as your preference. Think about showing grace to people when they don't want to be on the camera, and understanding that they might have things going on, whether it's childcare in the home, elder care in the home, that make them feel uncomfortable with showing up on the camera every day.
Yeah, I had to learn that lesson in COVID teaching at USC online,
Mhm.
and was like, okay, let me remember that all of these students are, I don't know where they are. Like some of
Yeah.
them may be home, some of them are maybe driving from somewhere, maybe in a dorm with multiple roommates or whatnot. And so I was like, if you want to come on camera, you can. If you're not able, that's okay. And you just have to trust that
Yeah.
they're getting the information
Yeah.
as
I
the semester goes along. And it is what it is.
Yeah. I think too, you can say, for instance, Garland, the days that maybe you brought the guest speaker in, those are camera days. And so the expectation is set, but it doesn't have to be every single meeting. I think people are willing to kind of meet you halfway. This draconian all or nothing binary approach, we're not in a black and white world. We're in a very gray world. And I think the more we can be flexible, that we can offer options to people, those are the little things that folks remember when a recruiter like you or I were to reach out to them about a new opportunity. If they feel seen and heard and respected, which falls into these types of categories, like, are they in a bullpen environment and they can't hear themselves think? And at the same time, when they go into the office, you put them on Zooms all day long, and all these different things about the way that we work. Ultimately, bundle that into what your candidate or employee experience is, and that's what determines your retention and environment, and all of these things are a part of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we will be putting a lot of interesting links in the show notes in order
Mhm.
for you to look at some, not of course, resources, some possible book ideas, because we're both
Yeah.
bibliophiles. We love a book.
Yes.
Whether you're listening to that audio or actually reading it, that's you.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think it's really important to familiarize yourself with this if you haven't heard about it, if you haven't thought about it, because what I think it will do is create more empathy. My
Yes.
hope is that it creates more awareness and understanding that we're all not processing the world the same, which I think some people just haven't really thought about. And it's very much this next generation, they are disclosing in high school, I'll tell you that. And they're looking at people crazy if they're not getting what they need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that's great. And I just want to remind you that 1 in 5 people that you love, work with, or are friends with is neurodivergent. And that fact, I think, should just stick with you. So think about that as you're moving through the world, as you're interacting with people, as you're kind of experiencing the world. And like Garland said, I think empathy is the biggest thing. I think education comes with empathy. And I'd love to hear from you. I know Garland would love to hear from you too. If you like this episode, if you have additional questions, we've got a lot of fun conversations planned for you. And we're so happy that you joined us today on Work Life Unraveled.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Unraveled with Garland and Allison. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts.